Well, hello and welcome to another Pressing In. My name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here at Blue Ridge. Our desire and goal here at Pressing In is to take what we're talking about on a Sunday morning and look for ways in which we can apply it to our lives throughout the rest of the week. And we're doing this by interviewing leaders and experts around Blue Ridge here on a weekly basis. I'm especially excited today to have with us Dr. Greg Mears, a licensed professional counselor here in the state of Virginia and a Blue Ridger. And our goal here is to talk about mental health and COVID, especially in this season, and the effects it's having on many of us. Well, Greg, thanks for joining us for Pressing In. I'm excited to see where God really leads this conversation. So I know you've served at Blue Ridge here and on the guest services team. And so most people, they may recognize your face, but I'm sure most people don't know your story. And so would you just kind of share with us a little bit about you before we jump in?
Okay. I was raised in a Christian home, went to a Christian school for actually the entirety of my education, went to a Christian college. And after that, began to question my faith. I really hadn't had a chance to do that before and saw a lot of hypocrisy and also learned a lot of good things. I did learn the truth about who God was during those times. It took about a 10-year journey where initially I would have considered myself an atheist, just rejecting everything. And ultimately, I have to have the answers to questions. And as I explored atheism, it just doesn't have satisfying answers for me. I started looking and exploring and asking questions and finally came to the belief there has to be a God. If there's a God, then who is that God? Beginning to end, the only thing that offers a beginning, a middle, and an end, that is our future, is the God of the Bible. And understanding who he is, I found myself one day when I reached that realization. I was in a small town in a national forest, a place where I love very much and should have been very happy and at peace, and I wasn't. And I said, okay, God, I believe you're there. I believe you're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Show me how you see me. And in that moment, all of the crud in my life started to parade itself through my mind, which was, as you can imagine, a wonderful experience. I started crying and I'm thinking, great, great. This is how you see me. And when I've explained this story before, I tell people, you're going to know what the words mean that I say. But for me, it was a very real experience. I literally felt two arms go around me. And I heard a voice, and it was not an audible voice. It was inside of my head, but I knew who it was. And it was Jesus. And he just simply said, as all this garbage is playing through my memory, I love you. And when you come from a legalistic background, love is really not something that is predominant. It's spoken about, but it's not felt. It's not experienced. And that for me was part of what brought me back to faith. I went to school for a number of years, actually. I was in respiratory therapy, so there's some overlap here with the COVID-19. Taking care of people in negative pressure rooms where you put people with highly infectious diseases. So I've actually done that work. And then my best friend's father was a psychologist, rather. And I asked him, I was thinking about changing careers, and I always had an interest in mental health. And I asked him about that, and he said, oh, if I was doing this again, I would never go into this field. I went, oh, okay. Somebody I respected. So I kind of put it off for a few years, but I really felt like there was something there that I needed to do. And that's what I wanted to. I felt like that's what I was created to do. And so after a few years, I set that aside and went back, got my master's degree, and then a little bit later got my doctorate.
So tell me, how have you seen in your experience so far, your faith and your experience in counseling, how do those things interact as a professional counselor?
They're inseparable. The way that our minds, we tend to put things into boxes, English, math, science or biology, chemistry, physics, however you want to phrase that, music, art. We put them in these little categories, and we only do that because our minds are only capable of understanding very limited amounts. So you have specialists in certain areas, and they might be good at some other areas. This is why we use the term Renaissance man, somebody who's good in several different categories. But there are no real boxes around these things. They're all interrelated. You think about sports and athletics. Well, there's a rhythm to that. It's almost lyrical. It's musical. You look at poetry. Again, there's music in it. With mathematics, there's rhythm. Okay, there's just so many things that are intersected, and we try to understand them all. And of course, physically, we cannot. And that's again why we break them down into smaller boxes.
I'm sure in your years of experience as a professional counselor, you've seen all sorts of things. This season, I know for a pastor and of 20 years, this is the most unique season for me in trying to lead. How have you seen, in your experience so far, how have you seen COVID and this season of isolation? What are you seeing the effects being, and how do they differ from maybe what you've seen in the past, or are they different maybe?
Well, that's an interesting one. Maybe more extreme. One of the things we look at with behavior is we look at if we have a good behavior that we want to encourage, we look at increasing the frequency, intensity, and duration of those behaviors. If it's negative behavior, we want to decrease the frequency, intensity, and duration of those behaviors. And in this case, I see people who are struggling with anxiety and depression. Maybe it's been a typical level. It hasn't really been that distressing. Now it's reaching a place of distress because what has been firm ground underneath them before, what they thought was firm ground underneath them before, a stable job, a good retirement, a safe community, these things have been turned upside down. When you can't even buy toilet paper, it rocks people, as silly as it sounds, it rocks people's sense of security and safety. I now have the money to buy something, but the product isn't there to buy. And that's a new level of stress for Americans because we're simply not used to that. And so it provides a lot of challenges, but it also provides really a lot of challenges for people who have substance abuse issues because it's already difficult or any addictive behavior because we use addiction to help us deal with the stressors. And so people are already struggling with these issues, oftentimes without the support of a community, face even more difficult times.
People right now feel like what I'm hearing is often they're the only ones struggling in this way. And I think that's the case with mental health a lot of times. Like it's still mental health issues still have a stigma, and even within the church, I gave my life to Christ. Shouldn't this stuff just go away? So it gets more stigma within the church, probably. And so it becomes a source of shame. It becomes even a source of isolation even more. And in this season, I think people even feel more. I said, what are you seeing the effects in the people that you're seeing, the conversations that you're having there in this isolation and them believing that they're the only ones alone or only ones struggling, I guess I should say?
Well, a lot of people do feel that way. They think everybody else is handling things well. And there are so many factors that flow into that. You've got the false fantasy of social media where everybody posts what's going on good in their life, but they don't post the reality. And so there's that. There's the fact that because we're not as social anymore, we don't engage with conversations or in those types of conversations with people because we're not around them as much. We're not with our coworkers as often in the same way that we used to be. And then there's simply the emperor has no clothes fable where we look at it and it's like, well, I can't let anybody know that I'm having problems because nobody else is having them. And so there's so many factors, even beyond the three that I've listed, that play into this. And the truth is that they're not alone. There's another element to this too, is that when we talk about anxiety and depression, we see them as negatives. And to be honest with you, they're not always. And what I mean by that is anxiety, there's a time where it is appropriate. And anxiety, depression, and a number of other things are warning signs. Hey, something's not right here. If you're driving down the road and you hit a slick spot, maybe it's been raining and all of a sudden you hydroplane a little bit, that anxiety you feel, that adrenaline rush, is that, hey, something's not right here. I need to slow down just a little bit. And that's appropriate. If you're going too fast on a road that you don't know and all of a sudden you come you're doing 60 and you come to a corner that says you should be doing 30, I'd feel a little bit anxious. That's appropriate. And similarly, when we lose someone or something that's dear to us, we feel a sense of loss. We feel down, and we should.
Hmm.
That is healthy. So anxiety and depression in and of themselves are not necessarily negatives. They're something we don't like to experience, but it's only when they get out of balance that they become a problem.
Oh, that's good. I've really never heard anybody put it in that exact way. So in the isolation, in the feeling alone, in the thinking that I'm the only one struggling, and to be honest, in this season, for somebody who's really never struggled with depression, struggles to often empathize and sympathize because I don't have a category, and it's been one of those Achilles heels of mine in my leadership. I think through a lot of leadership with people that struggle in these ways. I even found myself going to these dark places over the last month or two as this whole thing's going on. What would your advice be? What are some practical steps a person could take that feels alone, feels isolated, feels like they're the only one struggling, especially when I hear this often, maybe I don't even feel like I have the motivation to do anything about it in this moment. What would you say to a person there?
Well, if somebody's feeling a lack of motivation, they're moving well into the clinical depression, where it's affecting their ability to enjoy life around them. They're losing motivation, and so they want to. Well, let me step back from that just a second and talk about something called the biopsychosocial spiritual model.
Okay.
And address it from that perspective. And what that simply means, bio is the biological component.
Uh-huh.
Psycho is the psychological component, social is the social component, spiritual is the spiritual component. And so when we're looking at issues of isolation and you're moving into that depression, we really want to take a look at what's going on from in the order that I mentioned, biopsychosocial, spiritual. So we want to consider, are there some biological issues why I'm feeling this way right now? There might be some medical issues, things like hypothyroidism can be an issue, for example. And so we want to say, maybe we want to go see our doctor and just say, hey, is there something wrong? And we know there's some other things going on. We recognize that. But maybe some of these things that haven't really been out of whack too badly, with every stress that we have, has kind of increased that and made us a little more susceptible. And when we look at the psychological, then you want to look at that mental health piece. How do am I seeing somebody for mental health, whether it's a psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, social worker? Am I seeing somebody? And if I am or have been, maybe I need to re-engage with that person or continue to engage with that person. If I'm taking meds, I should probably continue with them unless there's some sort of issue with that, where you're having some bad side effects, and then you need to talk to your professional about that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, and you're all of a sudden experiencing things you haven't experienced before, then maybe you want to go see somebody and talk through some of these things. Say, hey, I really haven't seen these things before. And I want to make a comment about that just real briefly. You gave the example of yourself, and sometimes we think we're built on a really solid rock. Mm-hmm. And because we live in America, sometimes that rock isn't as solid as we think it is. Mm-hmm. It's again, I have a secure job. I have these things around me. I've got family and friends. I've got a great support system, which is wonderful to have. But COVID-19 has really pulled a lot of those things out from under us. Mm. And so we're now finding, hey, the things that I thought were solid aren't. What does this look like? Are we ever going to get back to normal, or is this the new normal? And so we're asking ourselves questions that we really haven't had to ask before with any kind of depth. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that we ask ourselves those questions. It's revealing to us maybe a part of us that we could strengthen and encourage and grow.
Yeah.
The social COVID-19 has really hit that one. Yeah. Because our ability to connect with others in ways that are meaningful, and a lot of people find, being around others and having that physical touch, that hug, that hand on the shoulder, that handshake, they miss that. And it's a very integral part of who we are as people. God created us for relationship. And in some ways, we're now technologically connected, but we're not physically connected. And while I appreciate the technology, and it's good in a lot of ways, it is not a substitute for the physical connection.
No.
And so there's that piece. And of course, there's the spiritual piece where we really need to ask ourselves, what is our connection to God? Who is he in all this? Is he really our rock? Or am I trusting in my retirement plan, in my job, in my family and friends if things go south, in the cabin I've got stashed away somewhere with all my extra supplies? Is that where my faith is?
No, that's really good. You mentioned something in the beginning that, again, I think in Christendom sometimes it gets a negative stigma. And I've heard this from really close friends who've battled with depression. And that's the whole thing with medication. Going at this from a medical standpoint and a medication, going, well, this is what it is. I prayed to God to heal me. I prayed that I'd feel better. I don't feel better. So that must be, it's a problem with my faith, because certainly if I had enough faith, I could move this mountain in my life kind of idea. And so, but I see almost this anti-desire to do some of the practical things like you talked about, the physical. Talk to me about the stigma with medication and your perspective as a follower of Jesus and a professional counselor.
Okay. A couple things to tuck away are Paul's just brief comment to Timothy about taking a little wine for his stomach's sake. Yeah. There's clearly a physical problem there. And he's saying, hey, here, basically take some Pepto-Bismol, do something for your stomach. And not to go into the whole alcohol debate there. But the other comment is Paul's prayer that the thorn in the flesh would be taken away. And we don't know what that was, whether it was spiritual, whether it wasn't. But the bottom line is God says, no, I'm not doing that. Because we have this God is fairy godmother concept within Christianity. I have a problem. I pray to God, bibbidi bobbidi boo. He makes it okay. And I go on, life is great. And that's never the promise in Scripture. You look at people in Scripture, look at Joseph's life and what he went through. God knew, and Joseph said this to his brothers. You planned this for evil, but God intended it for good. But it was not a pleasant journey for Joseph. I mean, it was not. Well, I'm not going to go into this whole story, but it's remarkable. And if we think that our life is supposed to be somehow, uneventful, we're not understanding who God is and what he does and how he works. In terms of medication, there are some fundamental things. Medication, by and large, and certainly within the mental health field, does not solve a problem. It can help us manage symptoms. And the example is if you stop taking medication, what happens? The issue comes back. And that's just telling you all you're doing is managing symptoms. Medication in the broader context, there aren't that many medications that solve problems. Antibiotics can, some chemotherapy can, but by and large, there's just not a lot out there that solve problems. They help us manage pain, discomfort, things like that, or negative symptoms like maybe shaking. But it's important to understand, and this is that mind-brain distinction I had mentioned to you earlier. We have both a mind and a brain. And their brain is the physical structure, is the physical structure that sits inside of our skull. Our mind is something different. They're very much connected. They're symbiotic, but they are distinct. So our brain is affected by things like neurofeedback, audiovisual entrainment. I'm just mentioning some interventions without trying to get into it too much. On the other side is our mind, and things like cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, the spiritual disciplines, mindfulness, things of those nature can affect that side of it. And if we understand the neurobiology, our neurons have, so I'm going to use my arm. This will be the axion. The neuron is here, and part of it is the axion. At the end is what's called a terminal button. So I'm putting another terminal button with an axion together, and that space in between is called a synapse. Our brain is an electrochemical organ, so there's electricity and chemicals. You have the electrical that comes down through, and it stimulates the release of neurotransmitters. These are things like serotonin, norepinephrine. from vesicles inside the terminal button into this space in between the two terminal buttons called the synapse. The chemical travels from one to the other where it's picked up, and it triggers an electrical signal to go down through the axon, down into the neuron, out to another terminal button. This happens, of course, very, very quickly. On the brain side of things, neurofeedback, medications, things like that, those influence. Neurofeedback works on the electrical side, and medication works on the chemical side. Now, there's a whole series of these neurons that are connected in series. And we create in these series of connections either maladaptive or adaptive pathways. Maladaptive or unhealthy pathways, adaptive pathways are healthy pathways. Those are affected by our mind, the pathways that we create with these neurons. And so by changing our thoughts, and scripture talks about taking every thought captive, cognitive behavioral therapy is very scriptural. And it's also the most well-researched, most effective, one of the most effective therapies in general sense out there. By changing the way we think about things, we can change actually the physical structure of our brain. We can stop those maladaptive pathways, and we can create those adaptive pathways. Think of those pathways as an animal trail in the woods. If the animals continue to travel those trails, they'll stay open. You'll be able to notice them. If they stop traveling them, they will grow back over, and you'll never know there was a trail there. And so we create that new trail. We no longer use that negative trail, that maladaptive trail, and we can overcome a lot of things. Now, with things like addiction, it's similar. And to give you some background, my family had a cabin in the national forest where I grew up, and we would go back in there fishing, way back in where nobody was. And there would be these old railroad trails that were used to haul timber or coal or whatever. And they had removed the tracks and the rails, but you could still see the railroad bed snaking through the woods. Trees would not grow up in it by and large. They might fall over that railroad bed. But if somebody wanted to put a railroad through there again, they would not have to level the grade. They would not have to put down the foundation or anything. It's still there. And addiction really seems to be resistant in that way. It's rather than an animal trail, addiction seems to be like that railroad bed that's had the tracks and rails removed, but it's very easy to go right back and put that track and rail there. We don't fully understand why these things are and how they work.
Maybe you've already answered this in part, but I want to ask it and just again, what would you say to the guilt-ridden follower of Jesus that says, I shouldn't struggle in this way?
I think that does go back to the verses I mentioned earlier about Paul's thorn in the flesh, his advice to Timothy regarding his stomach. The idea that God is not our fairy godmother. That if we recognize that God does not promise us an easy path, read Job.
The word trauma is a word that has come up a lot. I mean, I hear it all the time right now. And then I think about COVID and everything that's going on along with that, with race and racism and, these murders and all those kinds of things. How is there, first of all, is it possible for a nation to experience collective trauma? And if it is, what are the kinds of effects that we would see from trauma on us and its effects? Yeah, walk me through what would that look like? How would that affect us? What are we seeing that would be a result of that?
I don't believe in a national trauma.
Okay.
Because I think people are people, and we experience traumas individually. Some people are more resilient than others. And so in this, what we do when we make things about groups of people, whether it's a nationality, whether it's a race, whether it's a religion, whether it's a gender, is we remove things from the individual and move them into a group. And it's hard to address things as a group. And so it removes personal responsibility for me. What am I doing to go out there and to make a difference in the world in which I live? In my sphere of influence. That's my job. My job is to love people the way that God called me to. My job is to support people and to be there. We're not supposed to go, be warmed and filled. God says that's nonsense. You look at James 2 and it's like, no, that's not what we're supposed to do.
Mhm.
We're supposed to show people our faith by our works. We're supposed to be out there making a difference.
Let's go down that path of our responsibility. So I am a self-identified in the sense of I struggle with seeing other people's pain and being able to engage with it and help them take steps towards help. Now, obviously, you can't change somebody who doesn't want to change. We know that. We've all tried to do that and failed miserably at it. Kind of those kind. That said, I do think God, Cain asked the question at the beginning of Scripture. Am I my brother's keeper? And I think God spends the rest of Scripture answering that question. Yes, you are. You are responsible in the way he made the church and the one another's and all that. So in this season where people feel isolated, where people, like you said at the very beginning, I thought very well, where people who are walking through mental health issues, this is only exasperating or accelerating or revealing how uncertain the ground really was below us. How do I, as a follower of Jesus, help bear my brother's burdens in this season? How do we do that for one another?
So there's an example I use, and it's not a perfect example. It has its logical inconsistencies, but bear with me. And this works for any relationship. It works for marriages. It works for parents and kids. It works for friendships. But if let's take it in a marriage. If we look at our spouse as a plant, and our job is to be the gardener for that plant. That plant needs to have water, sun, good soil. It needs to have protection from the insects or the mammals that would eat it. And that's the job of the gardener. And so I am my spouse's gardener. It's my job to create that healthy environment for my spouse. But I can never make my plant grow. Mm-hmm. That's the plant's responsibility. I can create a healthy environment, but I cannot make the plant grow. My job as a believer is to create that healthy environment. And conversely, it's my spouse's job to do the same for me. I am the plant, and my spouse is to create a healthy environment, and then it's my job to grow. She has no control over that.
What would you say is for somebody who does in our life, but we're at a loss of how to handle it? Somebody in our life is struggling with mental health, depression, anxiety. They want to move. They're just paralyzed right now. Maybe they're in the middle of that depression and they want to be out of it. We see it. They just what's a practical step or two that I could take to help that person move towards health?
One of the things is to use empathy, and there are a couple types of empathy. There's thought empathy and there's feeling empathy. Feeling empathy is simply recognizing what the other person is experiencing. And thought empathy is understanding why they're experiencing or why they're experiencing the feelings they're experiencing. So what are they experiencing? What emotion are they having? And why are they having that emotion? That allows us to find that empathy. Once we understand that, then we often know how to speak into that moment when we truly understand. Now, keep in mind, understanding is not the same thing as agreeing with what's going on with that person. And I think that trips a lot of people up. We think we have to agree with them in order to feel empathy for them. No, we don't. No, we don't. We may or may not, but it's not necessary for empathy. Once you have that empathy, I had a friend of mine whose father passed away a few years ago of cancer, and he had gone through the struggles, had some remissions. He was in the process of remission when all of a sudden he took a sudden turn and died. And my friend went to the funeral, and he came back a week or so later, and we were talking about the things that people say with good intentions. He's not experiencing pain. He's in a better place. Yes, that's true, but I don't care on some level because I lost my dad. He won't watch my kids grow up. I can't call him for advice. I can't share my excitement or my sorrow with him. And so people, because they didn't understand the empathy piece, they weren't able to connect with him. And we continued our conversation. I said, what did people say to you that was really helpful? And he said two things, and they're very closely related. He said, what do you need? How can I help? And sometimes in those moments when we don't know what to say, we can say those two things. And then there's another story, and it's also related to the passing. I had a coworker a number of years ago who had lost both parents in the same summer. And where she worked, there was a gentleman who was a big burly kind of guy, and he was known for giving bear hugs, and they were the welcome hugs. They weren't the creepy hugs. And when she came back to work after losing her second parent, he just wrapped her up in his arms. And he said, "Sugar, I don't know what to say." What he did with that action is say, "I don't have the answer and I can't make it better, but I'm here for you." And sometimes that's what people need to hear.
Yeah.
And they need to experience. I experienced that moment when Jesus wrapped his arms around me and said, "I love you."
Yeah. No.
And so when I describe that story, it's very moving for me.
Yeah.
Because that's what I experienced.
No,
from the creator of the universe.
It's really interesting you say that. Andy Stanley, in an intro to a talk he did recently, talked about Jesus coming to Lazarus' tomb. And he had the answer. He could solve the problem. Like, yep. On multiple levels, he could solve the problem. He could raise him back to life. We know that eventually he can give him eternal life. I mean, he has the answers to all of Lazarus' death problems. But what's the first thing that he does? He just wept with people. He just wept with them. Not because, and so he had the answers, and he still chose to start with entering into their pain with them, to feel their pain with them, to do that empathy side. He had compassion on them, and it says he wept. So it's really good in describing it that way. So, well, let me finish with this. What do you think the church could do better? Church leaders could do better? Blue Ridge? I mean, anything on Blue Ridge could do better as a church, as leaders at Blue Ridge. What could we do better to help enter into people's mental health struggles in this season and in the seasons to come?
I think there are a couple things, and I think that one of the very first ones is to kind of look for those people who might be in need. Start searching them out. We should start with those closest to us and then work out from there. So if we take care of our family, somebody else doesn't have to. And that frees them up to help someone else. So if we're doing what we need to do, then we can give out of our abundance and help a larger circle, the next group of people around us. And then the next, it might be our friends or our neighbors, it might be our coworkers then, it's going to just depend. But we start with that inner circle and we pay attention to those. The second thing is to listen, to use that empathy to really hear and be aware of what someone's saying and why they're saying it, what they're feeling. And using those two questions, what do you need? How can I help? And then follow through. James gives us that picture in, faith without works is dead. We can say be warmed and filled, I feel your pain, and then do nothing. That's worthless. It's a good start, but we have to finish it. We have to finish it.
I hear you there, because I am one who loves the sprint and then loves to move on to something new. The endurance is not the thing that I find myself getting distracted and wanting to move on. And it's interesting. I've been noticing how often Paul mentions endurance in the key of running the races that God has put out in front of us. So that makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate your time, Greg. I love the partnership with you in ministry, and it's just been a great relationship to start to foster, and I look forward to how God is going to use this. So thanks for being a part of Pressing In.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being a part of it.
Absolutely, sir.